Hey guys, as promised, here's a quick review of macro unit 3. So I'm going to go through, try to hit on some of the bigger points from this unit. Hopefully you're able to go through it yourself and learn most of it. All right, so let's get started here. All right, so the first thing in unit 3 is aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is pretty simple. It's everything, okay? So starting unit 3, kind of flipping back to micro unit 2 where we're going over supply and demand. If you remember for micro, where we're looking at one market or one firm, okay, now we're looking at everything. Okay, so aggregate demand is the demand for everything. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. As always, inverse relationship. Price level goes up, aggregate demand goes down, and vice versa. Okay, so here's what it's going to look like: a downward sloping demand curve. Okay, it's a regular demand curve. It's simply all of the demand curves added together. All right, as you see down there, aggregate demand is actually made up of the same 4 components of real GDP, which is why sometimes you will see real GDP instead of real GDP instead of output on the x-axis. Okay, so just like a demand curve, it can shift. Okay, so what are the things that are going to shift it? Well, they're going to be the 4 components that go into it, or the 4 components of GDP. So let's say we have an increase in spending, okay, whether it's consumer spending, investment, which is business spending, or government spending, or spending by other countries, which would be net exports. That's going to shift it to the right. Okay, let's say we have a decrease in spending, whether consumers stop spending, or businesses are spending less, or the government decides to cut spending. That's going to shift it to the left. So aggregate demand is pretty simple. Okay, it's the 4 components of GDP added together, they form a demand curve. If any one of those components changes, that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward for you. Okay, as I just talked about, we have the 4 components of GDP: consumer spending, investment spending. Okay, all these different things can change those. Okay, there's levels within them. Okay, consumer expectations right now is a great example of that. People aren't spending as much for a number of reasons. 1, because some people are out of money. 2, because they're not going out. But 3, there's people that are still working, right? Still getting their paycheck, but they're also not spending as much because they're fearing a recession. That's a great example of something that could change consumer spending. Investment spending, okay, businesses having more money. If they can borrow more money, they're going to spend more money, and so on and so forth. Okay, government spending, all right, that's pretty straightforward. If the government decides to spend more money or spend less money, that's going to change it. And then net exports, okay, net exports is exports minus imports. All right, next up, aggregate supply. Aggregate supply, same idea as aggregate demand, okay? It's all of the supply curves added together. All right, it's the supply for everything and everyone. Okay, there's 2 aggregate supply curves though. So here's the difference with aggregate demand. Okay, and there's only one aggregate demand curve. For aggregate supply, there's a short run aggregate supply and a long run aggregate supply. Think back to micro unit 3, where we had a short run and a long run. In the short run, things did not change. In the long run, things were able to change. That's exactly what's going to happen here. Wages and resources prices do not change in the short run. Also similar to micro unit 3, the short run and long run are not a specified time period. Okay, it's not like, oh, the short run's 3 months or the short run is 6 months. It's when prices do not change, and then the long run is when they are flexible and will change. Okay, so like I said, in the short run, wages and resource prices will not increase as price levels increase. Okay, so you're going to end up making more profit if price level goes up. So what does our short run aggregate supply curve look like? It looks like a regular supply curve. It's an upward sloping curve. Okay. What does our long run aggregate supply curve look like? Our long run aggregate supply curve is a straight horizontal line. Okay, no change as you go up. Okay, we're going to explore this a little bit more as we go through this. Okay, the long run aggregate supply curve always sits on what is labeled as QY. QY would be full employment. Okay, we're going to assume that we're always going to be in equilibrium at full employment. If you remember, full employment does not mean 0% unemployment. Full employment means no cyclical employment. In the US, that's somewhere between 4 and 6%, depending on the time. Okay, what are the things that are going to shift aggregate supply? Well, there's 3 different things, okay? So the supply curve can shift to the right or left. Well, let's look at what does it. Okay, so the first thing you have is resource prices. If what you're using to produce products goes up, that's obviously going to decrease the amount that you can produce because it costs you more money to buy more products, so therefore you can't produce as much. And then if the price of resources goes down, your supply is going to go up, okay? Number 2 would be changes in actions of the government. This one is big, and a lot of students get this confused. Changes in actions of the government is not government spending. Government spending is the government actually spending money. The government deciding to buy more planes, buy more buildings or whatever, okay? Changes in the actions of the government would be the government doing something. So as you can see here, they're doing something. Taxes, they're subsidizing, or they're coming out with regulations, okay? Think about GDP, okay? GDP, something needs to be produced. Government spending goes into GDP because something is produced. Taxes, subsidies don't because it's just moving money around. So hopefully that helps you understand that. And the third shifter of aggregate supply would be technology. Okay, technology gets better, supply goes up. We have an issue with technology, supply goes down. All right, so hopefully you're able to understand what aggregate demand and aggregate supply mean. Okay, so let's start putting them together. All right, so we have our aggregate demand curve, we have our aggregate supply curve. When we're at equilibrium, our long run aggregate supply is right there. As you notice down here, we're right on top of full employment. Okay, now let's start moving around. Let's assume there's an increase in consumer spending. What happens to price level and output in the short run? Okay, so hopefully in your brain you're thinking, okay, consumer spending, that is part of GDP, which is part of aggregate demand. There's an increase, so that's going to shift aggregate demand to the right. Okay, price level went up, quantity went up. Notice we are beyond full employment, okay, which is a good thing for a short time. We'll get to that in a little bit. All right, now, when that happens, you get gaps, okay? You have inflationary and recessionary gaps, okay? They're also called negative or positive output gaps, which we will go over, okay? So here are 2 graphs that we've already learned, okay? We've already looked at these before. We know that the economy can only be in one of 3 places at one time, okay? The economy can either be at full employment, it can be above full employment, or below full employment. Pretty simple, okay? So right here, we have what would be called a recessionary gap, okay? Hopefully you remember on our business cycle, we're in a recession. We are inside the production possibilities curve, so we are inefficient. We are underproducing. Another term for this is called a negative output gap. If we were on our full employment line, full employment line right here, we are at full employment, 5% unemployment, okay? We're producing where we should be. If we're above that, okay, so we're outside of our curve. Notice we can't, this would be 0% unemployment, max capacity. Okay, we're never gonna get there. We're approaching it though. Maybe this is 2.5% unemployment. Okay, we're hitting a peak. Okay, that would be a expansionary gap or what is called a positive output gap. Okay, so at any time we are in one of these 3 places. We're either in a recession, recessionary gap, we're at full employment on our line, okay, or we are expanding, okay, and we're hitting a peak. All right, so another example of looking at the graph, assume the government increases spending. What happens to price level and output? Again, government spending is part of GDP, which is part of aggregate demand. So if they increase government spending, our aggregate demand is going to go up. Okay, when that happens, we get an increase in price level, get an increase in quantity. Now think back, what type of gap is this? So are we below full employment or are we beyond full employment? Well, we're above full employment. Okay, so we are in an expansionary gap or what would be called a positive output gap. Okay, at a positive output gap, output is high and unemployment is less than the natural rate of unemployment. If you remember again, natural rate of unemployment is about 5%. So if we're here at a positive output gap, we're probably 3% unemployment, 3.5%. Okay, our economy is doing really well. Okay, our actual GDP is above, our potential GDP, but you look at it, our prices went up, so we're experiencing a little bit of inflation. All right, let's say consumer spending falls. Consumers stop spending money for any number of reasons. Okay, aggregate demand is going to go down. Aggregate demand goes down, price level's gone down, quantity's gone down. We are at what's called a negative output gap or a recessionary gap. Okay, we're experiencing deflation because prices have gone down, but we are below full employment. What does that mean? It means our unemployment's high. Maybe we're at 8-9% unemployment. Okay, things are not great. We're hitting a recession. Okay, the economy's struggling a little bit. Okay, output's low, unemployment's higher. Again, those are tied together. Okay, if there's no spending, businesses start to lay people off. When businesses start to lay people off, they don't produce as much. Okay, what about if there's a negative supply shock of oil? A supply shock would be a sudden change of the supply. And if it's negative, that means it's going to decrease supply. So that one's pretty simple. Okay, you're going to decrease your supply, you're going to move to the left. So that's what happens. Price has gone up and output's gone down. This is the worst case scenario for an economy. This is what's called stagflation. You have a stagnant economy, you have an economy that's producing below full employment, and you have inflation. This is still considered a recessionary gap, not an inflationary gap, which might be a little confusing based on the wording. But this is the worst possible scenario for a government, for a country and their economy, because you're producing less and charging higher prices. Both are big problems. So a decrease in supply is the one thing that you definitely don't want to happen. All right, let's say there's an increase in consumer spending. Okay, we already know that that's going to cause a positive output gap. Okay, you know the price level and quantity are going to increase in the long run. The short run. But what's going to happen in the long run? This is also similar to what we learned in micro unit 3, 4, 5. In the long run, things go back to where they are. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at here. So again, in the short run, wages and resources do not change. In the long run, wages and resources are flexible. Okay, long run aggregate supply looks like this. Okay, hopefully you remember that from a few minutes ago. Okay, it's on top of full employment. There's a couple things that can shift this long run curve though. Okay, before we go to moving it around. This curve can permanently move. That makes sense because an economy is not stuck where it's not like you can only produce X amount of units and that's all you can produce forever. An economy can continue to grow. Their natural rate of unemployment might stay the same, but they can produce more. Okay, so it can increase or decrease, shift to the right, shift to the left. Okay, what are some things that will do it? We have a change in resource quantity or quality, and we have a change in technology. Notice the same things that shift the long run aggregate supply curve were the things that shifted the production possibilities curve way back in unit 1. Okay, if we have an increase in resource quantity or resource quality or an increase in technology efficiency, long run aggregate supply curve goes to the right. Okay, our real GDP goes up. Our possibilities of what we can produce have gone up. Okay, now let's look at these two together. Right now we are at full employment. Okay, we are at long run equilibrium. Notice equilibrium. Okay, consumer spending goes up. We are in a expansionary gap. Okay, we are heading towards a peak, experiencing a little bit of inflation because prices have gone up. We are producing above where we normally produce. Okay, now what's going to happen? We know what's going to happen in the short run. I just showed you. What about in the long run? Okay, in the long run, wages and costs are going to go up. Why? Let's think about this. Okay, prices have gone up. Okay, think about macro unit 2. One of the things in inflation, when prices go up, workers have to demand higher wages because the cost of living has gone up, and that continues into a spiral. So if wages go up, supply is going to go down, because if you're a business and you have to increase the amount that you pay workers, you can't use that extra money to buy more resources and produce more products and so on and so forth. So your supply goes down. Based on this, our supply is always going to go back to where we were at long run. Okay, so think about micro unit 3. okay, where we always ended up back where we're constant cost. That's the same idea here. We're always going to go back to where we were on that long run aggregate supply line, except the price has gone up. Quantity goes back to where it was. Price levels have gone up though. So in this situation, we had an increase in demand, which increased price, increased quantity, followed by a decrease in supply, which increased the price again, but decreased the quantity. We end up right back at the quantity where we are, but we have a higher price level. So this leads to some inflation, but we're right back to where we were, same employment, okay, full employment, and so on. All right, what about if consumer spending decreases? So we have aggregate demand goes down. We are in a recessionary gap. Okay, you can see it over here on the business cycle. Now, we know, looking at this graph for this class, we know we are going to end up right on this line again. How are we going to get there? Well, if the demand was the first shift, supply has to be the second shift. Wages, costs eventually go down. How might wages go down? How might costs go down? If there's less consumer spending, I said this a few minutes ago, if there's less consumer spending, businesses start to lay people off. If they're laying people off, they're not paying as much. They can use that to start, kind of producing a little bit more. So what do we get? We go back to full employment at a lower price level. Back to full employment, back to that output, but we have a lower price level. Okay, so hopefully you can understand that. We have a shift in demand followed by a shift in supply. So we go from equilibrium to recessionary gap to inflationary, right back to where we were at equilibrium. Okay, so next up would be economic growth. How does an economy grow? How do we not go back to where we were? Well, there's a couple ways we can do that. So let's say we have investment increases. Investment, remember, is not stocks and bonds. It is business spending. That increases aggregate demand. Boom, right there. Price level goes up, quantity goes up, output, real GDP, all of that goes up. Now, think about this. If a business spends more money on capital goods, what is called capital stock, machineries, tools, technology, that is good for an economy. So what happens there, your supply goes up because the business is spending more, leading to a higher price level, but they are producing more. They are producing more in the future. So notice we did not go back to our old long-run aggregate supply. We get a completely new long-run aggregate supply curve that increases. It's the same idea as shifting out a production possibilities curve. Okay, again, investment goes up. Big point here, investment goes up. That is business spending on tools and machinery and technology. That causes our supply to go up in the future, which causes our long-run aggregate supply and our natural rate of unemployment to all be better. Okay, this does not happen with an increase in consumption or government spending. That does not cause economic growth. Economic growth is caused by spending on capital goods. All right, so very quickly, this unit talks about the idea of classical versus Keynesian theories. Okay, so we talked about Adam Smith way back in Unit 1, capitalism and all that. There's one big thing that Keynes kind of pointed out. So John Maynard Keynes was an economist. He helped point out some of the issues that were happening during the Great Depression. One thing that he points out is that the curve actually looks like this because instead of going straight down, okay, it's actually going to bend. What does that mean? He always assumed that, okay, when prices go up, workers ask for higher wages. Yes, that's true. When prices go down, workers don't ask for lower wages. So that was part of the problem, and that was part of the missing piece of Adam Smith. Adam Smith said prices go up, workers will get higher wages. Prices go down, workers will get lower wages. It doesn't always work like that. Okay, so the Keynesian range here, you see it plateaus. Instead of continuing down, it plateaus. And that was part of the problem, is that businesses did not understand during the Great Depression why they were still paying workers the same, why it wasn't changing. Well, part of it is because wages don't go down as much as they think. Okay, so this is just a small point, very unlikely to be asked about it on the AP exam, but just something that I wanted to mention very quickly. All right, so next up for this unit would be what is called the Phillips curve. Phillips curve shows the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay, so just like aggregate supply, there are two Phillips curves. There's a short run and a long run. The short run Phillips curve is a downward sloping curve. Why? Inflation and unemployment have an inverse relationship. When one goes up, the other one goes down. Okay, when the economy is overheating, low unemployment, high inflation. Okay, when we are doing very well, okay, so the economy is overheating, we're somewhere up here. Okay, high inflation, 5-6%, but maybe a 2-3% unemployment rate. Okay, when there's a recession, unemployment is high, but inflation is low. When there's a recession, unemployment is like 9%. Maybe we have a 1% inflation rate, if not 0. Okay, so this curve is tied together with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. You don't draw them on the same graph. They're not put together, but they're tied together. They would be drawn next to each other. Obviously, you're not going to draw them next to each other, but if you did, you can move things in similar directions and see how they're tied together. So let's say aggregate supply falls, causing stagflation. And that happens, both of these go up. Well, if both of them go up, what do we have to do? We get a new curve. Okay, why? Because we can't shift along the curve and increase both of them. So we get a brand new curve. So as you can see, inflation up, unemployment up. Okay, so if aggregate supply changes, you get a new curve. If aggregate demand changes, you slide along the curve. Say that again. If aggregate supply changes, you get a new Phillips curve. If aggregate demand changes, you slide along the Phillips curve. All right, so here's the long run Phillips curve. What is the long run Phillips curve? It is right on top of full employment. You can't really see past this, but 5% is what it says down here. Okay, in the long run, there's no trade-off between inflation and unemployment because we're always going to end up back at the natural rate of unemployment, which we have talked about. Okay, we're going to experience, prices are going to go up, boom, 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 whatever. You're going to end up back at the long run natural rate of unemployment on top of the long run Phillips curve. All right, so let's put the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and Phillips curve together. Okay, so as you can see, they're right next to each other. Okay, let's say aggregate demand goes up. Well, that's easy. You move aggregate demand to the right. Okay, well, what happened to our price level? What happened to our quantity? Price level went up, quantity went up. When quantity goes up, we have a lower unemployment rate. So price is up, unemployment rate down. What does that mean? Price is up, which is inflation, unemployment rate down. Okay, does everyone see that? They're color coded to help you understand what points are the same. So the yellows are the same, the reds are the same. Now, what if the aggregate demand falls? Okay, we are currently in a recessionary gap. Okay, aggregate demand is going to fall even more. So we're going to fall into a further recessionary gap. What's going to happen here? We continue moving to the right. Okay, so hopefully you guys see that. Let's go back. And you'll see that they actually move in the opposite direction. So demand increase shifts to the right. Well, if aggregate demand goes to the right, you slide to the left on the curve. Aggregate demand goes to the right, the Phillips curve, you slide to the left. Aggregate demand goes to the left, the Phillips curve, you slide to the right. Okay, so hopefully we understand that. Now, what about aggregate supply? I just mentioned this a few minutes ago. For aggregate demand, you slide along the curve. For aggregate supply, you move the Phillips curve. So let's say aggregate supply falls, moves to the left. Again, it's the opposite. So if we move to the left, the Phillips curve, we're going to get some sort of movement to the right. What we're going to get a completely new curve to the right. Why? Well, prices have gone up, but so has unemployment because output is down. So we have to increase our unemployment, increase our inflation. What about if aggregate supply goes up? We get a movement to the right, which means on the long run Phillips, on the short run Phillips curve, we're going to get a movement to the left. Okay, why? Prices have gone down, unemployment has gone down. Price down, unemployment goes down. Okay, hopefully all of you guys can see this. All right, so moving right along. Next up, we have the fourth topic in this unit. We have what's called fiscal policy. All right, so the government has two ways that they can try to stabilize an economy that's either overheating or in trouble. Okay, and that would be fiscal policy, monetary policy. Fiscal policy is Congress and the government actually doing something. Monetary policy is run by the Fed. Monetary policy is going to be what we talk about in Unit 4. All right, so there are two types of fiscal policy. There's what's called discretionary and non-discretionary. Non-discretionary fiscal policy are things that are automatically in place. Okay, so they're things that already exist. We'll talk about them in a little bit. Discretionary fiscal policy is when something happens in the economy and the government has to look at it and say, what do we need to do to try to fix this? The time right now is a great example. Okay, they are looking at the economy being torn apart by COVID and trying to see what do we have to do to try to fix this. And then they have two options of what they can do. They can either use contractionary fiscal policy or expansionary. And they're exactly what they sound like. Contractionary fiscal policy is to keep an economy from overheating. Now you might say, why would the government want to slow down an economy? Don't you want an economy to grow? Yes, but you don't want it to grow too fast. I talked about a car analogy. You don't want your car to overheat. You know, your car can go high speeds, but if it drives at those speeds for too long, eventually it starts to overheat, and that's no good for all the inner workings of the car, the engine, stuff like that. So you want to slow it down a little bit. Expansionary fiscal policy is when you're moving too slow and you need to kind of give it a boost. All right, so here's an example. We are looking at long-run aggregate supply. We are in a recessionary gap. How do we know that? We are below full employment. Okay. Aggregate demand looks like it's shifted down a little bit, and we're struggling a little bit. So what should the government do? Well, how do we want to get back? We're in a recessionary gap. Easiest way would be to increase this aggregate demand. How do you increase aggregate demand? You increase government spending. Okay. Now you're looking at this and saying, well, it's a $400 billion. We're at $400 billion. We want to be at $500 billion in terms of real GDP. So there's a $100 billion gap. But that's not how much you're going to spend. You're not going to spend $100 billion, because if they did that, you would end up all the way out here. You'd end up way increasing your aggregate demand. Now your economy is in a huge expansionary gap, and it's overheating. Okay. Well, why? Why wouldn't you want to just spend $100 billion and close the gap? Because there's something called the multiplier effect. Okay, which we're going to get to. So every time money is put into the economy, it's not just spent one time. Consumers get that money, they spend it. Businesses get it, they spend it. And money is spent over and over and over again. Okay, not every penny, some of it's saved, but money is spent multiple times. Okay, and what consumers do with it depends on what's called the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, it's how much people consume rather than save. It's always expressed as a fraction or a decimal. Okay, if you received $100, you spent 50, your marginal propensity to consume would be 50%. You receive $100 and spend 80, it's 0.8. $100, you spend 100, 1. The opposite of that is marginal propensity to save. It's just the opposite. Okay, if you receive $100 and you save 50, your MPS is 0.5. If you receive $100, your MPC is 0.7. What is your MPS? Well, they have to equal 1, so your MPS is going to be 3. What that means is you receive $100, you spend 70 of it, and you save 30. Okay, so MPS equals 1 minus MPC, or MPC equals 1 minus MPS. Because you can only do one of two things with it. You can either spend it or you can save it. Okay, so with that, using those numbers, we get what's called the multiplier. Okay, so the spending multiplier is 1 over MPS, or 1 over 1 minus MPC. So if the MPC is 1.5, the MPC is 0.5, how much is your multiplier? Well, if your MPC is 0.5, that means your MPS is 0.5. So 1 over 0.5 is 2. All right, so that's how you would find it out. Let's say the multiplier is 4. How much will an initial increase of $5 in government spending increase the GDP? How you use the multiplier is pretty simple. You multiply it by spending. So 4 times 5. So the answer there would be 20. You're going to get an initial increase of 20. What that means, the multiplier is how many times it's going to be respent. This $5 is going to be spent 4 times. That means it's going to add a total of $20 of spending. What about a decrease in $3? Again, the multiplier is 4. You simply multiply it by the number. 4 times 3. That means one person doesn't spend $3. The person they were going to spend that $3 or pay that $3 to now doesn't have $3 to spend it. They were going to eventually spend it. So $12 is taken out of the economy. All right, so let's look at some practice ones here. So if the MPC is 9.9, what is the multiplier? Well, 1 minus 0.9 is 0.1. So the MPS is 0.1. So 1 over 0.1 is 10. So for number 1, the multiplier is 10. If the MPC is 0.8, what is the multiplier? 1 minus 0.8 is 0.2. 1 over 0.2 is 5. If your MPC is 0.5, consumption increases 2 million, how much will GDP increase? So if your MPC is 0.5, that means your MPS is 0.5. 1 over 0.5 is 2. Consumption increases 2 million. 2 times 2, 4 million. If MPC is 0 and investment increases 2 million, how much will GDP increase? Well, if the MPC is 0, that means they save everything. The MPS is 1. 1 over 1 is 1. 1 times 2 million, it's 1. There's just a $2 million increase. Nowhere is there an MPC of 0. People are going to spend their money. MPC of 0 means people don't spend a dime that they make. That's not possible. All right, so let's practice on some graphs here. So we're in a recessionary gap. We can tell because we are below full employment. We are in a $500 billion gap. Our MPC is 0.8. Okay, so we know we're in a recessionary gap. We need expansionary fiscal policy. What are our 2 options? Expansionary fiscal policy, you can either increase spending, directly put money in, okay, or you can decrease taxes. The government can say, okay, we're going to tax less, so consumers have more money because they can spend. Both of those are going to increase your aggregate demand. Right now, we're looking at just government spending. What is the least amount of initial spending needed to close the gap? Well, we need to close 500 billion. Our MPS is 0.2. 1 over 0.2 is 5. Okay, so we need to spend 100 billion because that's going to get multiplied times 5. All right, what about now? We are in a expansionary gap. Okay, so we need contractionary fiscal policy. We need to close this gap. We are overheating. 20 billion. 2 options: decrease spending, increase taxes. How much? Well, if the multiplier is MPS is 0.5, the multiplier is 2. 1 over 0.5 is 2. So we need to cut spending by 10 billion. All right. So we're going to skip over this. We're going to look at taxes. For taxes, okay, it's the same idea, except cutting taxes doesn't work as efficiently. Okay, so assume the MPC is 0.75, so the multiplier is 4. If the government cuts taxes by 4 million, it's not going to cause a $16 million increase. Why? Because when consumers get the tax cut, that's like getting paid. So they're going to save $1 of it because 0.25, and they're going to spend the other 3. So the multiplier is going to be different. The tax multiplier is MPC over MPS. Instead of 1 over the MPS, it's MPC over the MPS. So if the spending multiplier is 4, the tax multiplier is 3. It's always going to be 1 less. Okay. Yes, you have the equation MPC over MPS, but if you have the spending multiplier, the tax multiplier is always 1 less. So going back, we need to spend 4 billion because we know the spending multiplier is 5. Okay, so it's 4 billion to close a $20 billion gap. Well, if the spending multiplier is 5, we know the tax multiplier is 1 less, it's 4. So it's 5 billion that needs to be a tax cut. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, so moving right along, Okay, next up, we have what are called non-discretionary fiscal policy. They are what are called automatic stabilizers. Things that exist in the economy that the government doesn't need to do anything to try to fix the problem. The progressive income tax system is the best example of this. Okay, people make more money, they pay more taxes. That helps slow down the economy a little bit. People make less money, they pay less taxes. That helps speed up the economy a little bit more. All right, let's practice again here. Congress uses discretionary fiscal policy to manipulate the following economy. Type of gap, we are in a recessionary gap. We are below full employment. We need to expand the economy. We can do this by cutting taxes or increasing spending. How much spending should they do? Well, it's the same as before. We have a $200 billion gap. Okay, multiplier 1 over 0.2 is 5. So how do you get that? $40 billion spending. That $40 billion spending will be multiplied by 5, and you'll close that $200 billion gap. All right. Last thing for this unit is just some problems with fiscal policy, which I'm going to go through quickly. The first one is what's called deficit spending. Okay, a budget deficit's when the government's expenditures exceed its revenue. Surplus obviously is when they have more revenue than expenditures. The debt is the accumulation of all of these deficits over time. If you know anything about our economy, our debt keeps growing and growing and growing. Why? Because we keep deficit spending. So that's one of the problems associated with fiscal policy, because the government just tries to spend its way out of problems in the economy. Well, when you have to borrow money to do that, obviously that's a problem. Okay, the second one would be problems of timing. Okay, you have recognition, administrative, operational lags. Basically, by the time people realize what's going on, then they get it pushed through Congress and all that, it might be too late, and the economy might already be on the uptick. This doesn't happen all the time, but this is just part of the problem. The third one would be politically motivated policies. Generally, it doesn't win you many elections when you go up there and say, I'm going to raise your taxes and we're going to spend less as a government. Well, sometimes that's what you need to do to slow down an economy, but that doesn't always work. So sometimes you get people that come to power that want to cut taxes, and that ends up speeding the economy up way too much. The fourth one would be what's called crowding out. Okay, so crowding out, the AP exam likes to emphasize this. So let's say we have a recessionary gap. Okay, the government creates a new library that increases aggregate demand, but consumers are now spending less on books. This decreases aggregate demand. That's one simple example. Another example, and what the AP exam really likes to emphasize, is the borrowing aspect of it. If the government wants to increase aggregate demand, they borrow money to do so. This causes the interest rate to go up because the demand for money is higher. This is what we're going to talk about in Unit 4, but kind of need to follow along here. So interest rates go up because interest is the price of money. If interest rates go up, that means businesses can't borrow as much. So investment is going to fall. So by increasing the aggregate demand through government spending, you're actually making it a little bit harder for aggregate demand to grow because you are decreasing investment. The government has crowded out consumers or investors who are trying to also borrow money and spend. So as you can see here, you're going to increase demand for money, which causes the interest rate to go up. And that makes it harder for businesses to borrow. And the last one would be the net export effect. All right, international trade reduces the effectiveness of fiscal policies. Okay, so let's say the government increases to try to push us out of a recessionary gap. The increase causes an increase in price level, which causes our goods to be more expensive for the world. And that kind of lowers our net exports a little bit. Okay, all of these things exist, but there's trade-offs. Okay, if all of these were constant problems, we wouldn't use fiscal policy at all. The problem is you have to understand, is the fiscal policy worth it and outweighs these problems? All right, so looking at this, we've already looked at these 4 graphs: production possibilities curve, business cycle, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and Phillips curve. Okay, you need to know all 4 of these and how all 4 of these tie together and how you can show the economy in full employment, a recessionary gap, and an inflationary gap. All right, so hopefully this helped you guys. Okay, hopefully this quick review, I know I went really fast, hopefully it helped you understand Unit 3 a little bit better.